This is the first passage in the reading section. Let's read the blurb. This passage is adapted from Meg Wolitzer, The Wife, originally published in 2003. The narrator, a student at Smith College, a women's college, is enrolled in a creative writing class in the 1950s. So things to keep in mind, it was published in 2003, but it's taking place in the 1950s. Also, what stands out to me is that the title is The Wife, and they're emphasizing that she is in a women's college in a creative writing class. And keep in mind that, feminism and women's rights, those are typical themes that the SAT likes to explore. So historically, a lot of reading passages on the SAT have dealt with topics like that. So in the first paragraph, it opens up by saying, write what you know. And automatically when I read this, if you're starting with, sort of an aphorism or a saying like that, you automatically know that this is probably going to be a theme throughout the passage. So we'll keep it in mind. And this was said by Professor Castleman. I always like to box my characters because I'm terrible at remembering names. And he's obviously the professor in the creative writing class. So the next paragraph is really just talking about her difficulties that she's finding in writing, because it says, that night after dinner, shepherd's pie, and she was looking at it, trying to describe it to myself in a writerly fashion, but the best she could come up with was pathetically a roof of mashed potatoes spread thickly atop a squat house of meat. So I'm thinking that the reason that they put this in the paragraph is because that's actually a pretty good and entertaining description of what shepherd's pie is. But maybe at the time her perception of it was that it wasn't a great description. And then it says basically she went up to the library and she starts talking about these scientific abstracts, the annals of phytochemistry. And the reason she's mentioning that is not going to become very clear until the next paragraph, but she does say in line 15, I wondered if anyone would ever again open any of these books, or if they'd be shut for eternity. So in the next paragraph, she's still thinking about whether she's going to open one of them and start to read it. And here it becomes clear why she's thinking about this, because it says in line 20 to 21, did it make sense to try and write? What if no one ever read what I wrote? So basically she's comparing her writings to these scientific abstracts in the library, because she's noticing that, hey, probably nobody reads these things, maybe besides the small community who is actually interested in these topics. In the next paragraph, she's going to start to reflect on her life. So look at what it says in line 29. She's still in the library, and she said, I tried to imagine what it was that I actually knew. And this is obviously recalling the theme that we pointed out in line 1, where Professor Castleman said, write what you know. So she's going to talk about this trip to Rome and Florence, and she's using it really as an example or as an analogy of the idea that she really doesn't have a lot of experience. The way she describes it is that she took this trip, but in line 33, she was under the protection of good hotels and behind this green glass window of tour buses. And the conclusion is line 36. The level of my experience and knowledge had remained the same, hadn't risen, hadn't overflowed. And she's implying the same thing about the other Americans. In the second half of the paragraph, she's going to start talking about random things that also backs up the idea that she doesn't have a lot of life experience. She says in line 41, she's never been in love. She never had went to a political meeting in someone's basement. She never did anything that could be considered independent. So you might be thinking as you're reading this, well, maybe you don't have to do those types of specific things to really say that you've lived an experienced life. And that's probably true. Keep in mind she's writing this from the perspective of someone who's much older. At the very end of the paragraph, she touches on something that's going to become more important in the passage. She says in line 44, at Smith, the college, girls surrounded me, the equivalent of those American tourists, girls in groups, were as safe as shepherd's pie. Again, going back to what she said in the first paragraph. And then the next paragraph, she actually gets down to start writing. So she says, I made myself begin to write something, and she didn't censor it or condemn it for being trivial. So basically, she just started writing freely. And here's where one of the other themes comes out in the passage in line 51. She says, I wrote about the impenetrable wall of femaleness that formed my life. And then she talks about perfume. She talks about being at this girls' school where she's surrounded by 600 females. And that's actually going to be the theme of her writing. Essentially, you can say that this is what she actually knows, the fact that she's been surrounded by girls all her life. And then the next paragraph, she starts thinking about her professor, Professor Castleman. So she goes on to describe his appearance, and the impression that you get is he's probably your stereotypical older professor, maybe a little bit aloof. But the reason that she mentions him is in line 64 because she's imagining what it's like to be him. She says, maybe that's what it was like to be a writer. Even with the eyes closed, you could see. So that's why she's thinking about him, because she views him as a writer. The next paragraph talks about how she went to his office hours, and really she's waiting with a lot of, she says, rabid anticipation. So she probably wants to talk to him about something very important, and we're going to learn later in the passage that the reason for that is because it was about the piece that she had written. The rest of the paragraph is talking about her thoughts as she's waiting to see the professor. She reflects on this girl named Abigail Brenner, one of the other students, and it's kind of funny the way she describes it. She says, she came out of the office holding her tedious story about her grandmother's recent death from double pneumonia, which she had been reworking pointlessly since the first day of class. So it seems that she's criticizing her story because she calls it tedious, and she says that she's pointlessly been reworking it. It's possible that this is a positive by saying that it's pointless to rework it. Maybe it was good, but I think in general this is a criticism. And then at the very end is where she finally gets to talk to him. So she says, hello, Professor Castleman. And he says in line 87, so your story, I've read this twice, he said, and frankly, both times I found it to be wonderful. So that's the conclusion of this passage. Basically, it implies that what she had written about being surrounded by females all her life, it actually turned out to be a good story. And so if you're thinking about, where the passage has gone, you're going to recall the opening, which talked about write what you know. So it seems that at this point she found something that she knew about, which is basically her own experience being in like an all girls college and being surrounded by females and maybe being sheltered. And because she knew about that, it turned out that she wrote something good. Now, because this passage is so straightforward, I don't really think there's a need to annotate it, but if you wanted to do it, you can do it real quickly. So again, in the very first paragraph, we're talking about this theme of writing what you know. In the next part of the paragraph, she's talking about being in the library, mentioning the scientific abstracts, and then what's the reason that she's mentioning them? Again, it's because right here in 21, she's questioning whether or not she should write, whether or not she should consider that as a career possibly. In the second column, she's considering her lack of experience. So I'm just going to write experience over here. And then there are some examples down here in lines 42 to 40 and on. So in line 44, first mention of the theme, which I'm basically just going to write as females. And then it comes to a head in line 52, where she really discovers what the theme of her writing is going to be. So I'll just write females again. Next paragraph, she's basically thinking about her professor. The paragraph after that, this is when she's waiting in his office or outside his office for his office hours. And the story really comes to a climax when the professor gives his reaction to her story, and it turned out to be very good. So all in all, I'd say that's the most amount of annotating that you need to do for this passage. On to the questions. Number 1, which of the following statements best summarizes the passage? So for this question, there's really no specific place to look back in the passage. You kind of just have to keep in mind overall what the passage is doing. And for this type of question, our annotations probably will help. So let's go through the answer choices. A writer embarks on a search for an audience that understands her work. So like many questions on the SAT, especially in the reading question, usually one word or a phrase can throw the answer off. So you could say she went on a search, but it's not for an audience that understands her work. There is really no mention anywhere in the paragraph about her writing to people that didn't understand her work or didn't understand her experience. So A, not going to be it. Choice B, a writer demonstrates persistence in overcoming a variety of challenges. Persistence, maybe, but really what makes B wrong is probably a variety of challenges. generally, the passage is talking about her one challenge, which is figuring out what she knows. You could interpret a variety of challenges, maybe the fact that she doesn't have experience, but B is a little bit off in that sense. There's probably going to be a better answer. Choice C, a writer succeeds in conveying her experience in an authentic way. So this one seems to work because conveying your experience in an authentic way, when they say authentic, they mean real or true. They're echoing that theme that we highlighted in the passage summary about writing what you know and writing your experience. So C seems like it's going to work, so we'll keep it for now. A is definitely wrong. B seems a little bit off. Choice D, a writer gradually recognizes her need for intellectual exchanges. So nothing in the passage talking about how she needs intellectual exchanges or how she's not stimulated. So all that means is that choice C is going to be our best choice. Question 2, the narrator indicates that her attempt to think in a writerly fashion during dinner was, so let's go back to line 8 and look at it. So here, this is where she's describing the shepherd's pie. Start at line 6. That night after dinner, shepherd's pie I remember, for I sat there looking at it, trying to describe it to myself in a writerly fashion, though the best I could come up with was pathetically, and then she describes it, a roof of mashed potato, blah, blah, blah. So right here, the line that I underline in line 9, that shows you that she views her writing as very bad, because she says the best I could come up with, and she calls it pathetic, was a roof of mashed potatoes spread thickly atop a squat house of meat. So like I said, I actually think that's a very entertaining description of shepherd's pie, and I'm willing to bet that the writer Meg Wolitzer also views it that way. That's why she included it. But the point was, back then she kind of viewed it in a very negative light. So let's look at the answer choices. Unnecessarily distracting. It's not so much distracting because it's not making you think of anything else. So we'll cross off choice A. Pitifully inadequate. So yeah, what I want to point out about choice B is that a lot of times in the SAT, the answers are actually just substituting one word for another. So pitifully inadequate is really echoing pathetically and the best I could come up with. So that's exactly how they're able to justify that as the answer. So B is likely going to be it. C, vastly entertaining. So again, this is a very positive description. She was obviously not viewing it in the positive light. D, moderately serviceable. I have no idea what that means. If something's serviceable, maybe it means she can use it for something, but definitely not what she's talking about. So B is going to be the best answer. Question 3, based on the passage, which of the following risks that writers may face is a concern to the narrator? So again, this is kind of a generalized question. One thing to keep in mind is that the questions on the SAT generally follows the order of the passage, but let's look over the answers first. Choice A, being misunderstood by readers. So I don't really think she mentions that anywhere, the fact that readers are going to write what she wrote and then misinterpret it. Choice B, being overlooked by readers. So this is a definite possibility, and this goes back to the whole discussion about the scientific journals that she was looking at it. So let's take a look at it real quick. Recall that she mentioned coming upon these volumes of scientific abstracts, and then she said in line 15, she wondered if anyone would ever again open any of these books. Why is she thinking about that? Because she's relating it to herself in line 20. Did it make sense to try and write? What if no one ever read what I wrote? What if it languished untouched on the chilled shelf of a college library forever? So all this is talking about the possibility that her writing would get ignored, untouched, overlooked. And that's what they're talking about in choice B, so that's likely the answer. Choice C, revealing personal feelings to readers. So again, it doesn't really seem that she has a problem revealing her personal feelings, because she does end up talking about a very personal topic, being surrounded by mostly females. So C is not going to work. Choice D, choosing a topic that is unappealing to readers. So again, I think one thing that A, B, and D have in common is this appeal to readers, where she's not really concerned about whether the topic or the content that she's writing is going to be appealing to readers. She's more concerned in a general sense whether anyone's actually going to read what she writes. And obviously she's also concerned with writing something that she knows, because she feels that she's unexperienced or inexperienced. So all that means is that choice B is going to be the best one here. Question 4, which main effect do the words ignored, distant, and lone in line 24 to 27 have in conveying the mood of the narrator. So let's look back at that and see what it says. Again, this is where she's sitting down in the library thinking about all these scientific journals that never get read, and she's wondering the same thing about herself or her own writing. Line 23, it says, I sat down at a carrel, looking around the ignored spines of books, the light bulbs suspended in their little cages, and I listened to the distant scrapes of chair legs and the rumble of a lone book cart being rolled along one of the levels of the stacks. So what are these words tell us about her mood? Again, talking about ignored, distant, and lone, they're all talking about the writing, but she's using it in a way to convey her mood. So putting those three words together and thinking about where in the passage this is happening, to me, I get a sense of maybe despair, or I wouldn't go as far as losing hope, but she definitely feels, by herself, ignored, distant, lone, maybe neglected. So we'll just keep in mind those ideas. Let's go back to the question. It says choice A, they reflect her sense of isolation as a writer. So that's definitely a possibility. Those three words, ignored, distant, and lone, with nobody reading her. She's by herself in the library, so that kind of makes sense. So we'll keep that around. B, they hint at her underlying hostility to well-known writers. Nothing mentioned in the passage about other well-known writers or her being hostile to them. So that's definitely going to be off. Choice C, they emphasize her lifelong desire to become a writer. So that may be true. She might have a lifelong desire to become a writer, but the words ignored, distant, and lone do not contribute to that effect. C is going to be wrong for that reason. Choice D, they undercut her claims about the quality of her writing. So to say that they undercut her claims means that they're showing her claims to be false. So the assumption would be, given that these are negative words, that the quality of her writing is actually high. But clearly, if you're saying that the words ignored, lone, and distant they're actually negative words, so they're not going to undercut the claims about the quality of her writing, especially because she doesn't believe that her writing is probably very good at this point. So D is going to be out, and the best choice is A. Question 5 is using line 33, pinned most nearly means. So as I always say for these questions, go back, read it, pick your own word. Don't even look at the answer choices yet. Let's start reading from 30. So it says, I'd seen almost nothing of the world. A trip to Rome and Florence with my parents when I was 15 had been spent in the protection of good hotels and pinned behind the green glass windows of our tour buses, looking at the stone fountains, blah, blah, blah. So what does it mean to be pinned behind the windows of a tour bus? You get this image of her like kind of just looking out there like that, not really moving. So the word that comes to my mind is that she's probably like stuck behind the green glass window, because when you pin something to the wall, it's like saying you're going to stick it up there. And that's the literal meaning, but it could also be stuck in a more sort of figurative sense, that she feels like she is lacking freedom. But really, mostly on the SAT with these types of questions, they're looking for the literal meaning. Choice A, suspended. So probably not, because suspended means like you're hanging. So A is going to be out. Display means to show. So it's not saying that she was being displayed, through the window. Although, things can be displayed through the window or through a window if you want. Choice C, attached. So attached does seem close to the word stuck, so we'll keep it around for now. D, confined. Now, interestingly enough, confined does kind of go along with my word stuck, but only in sort of that idiomatic sense that she feels trapped. Really, though, they're talking about her being pinned behind the window. They're talking more about her physical position. So D is going a little bit too far. D connects with my word very well, but not so much with pinned. So we'll go with choice C, and that's going to be the answer. Question 6, the narrator suggests that her college classmates resemble the American tourists in which way? So this is not something that you will probably recall immediately just from reading the question. You're going to have to look back at the passage. So let's do that. So remember that she talks about that trip to Florence and the American tourists right around here, lines 30 to 45. She mentions her classmates down on line 44. So let's read it. It says, at Smith, girls surrounded me, the equivalent of those American tourists. And why is she making that equivalency? The next sentence says, girls in groups were as safe as shepherd's pie. So this is the connection that she's making between her classmates and the people on the tour. Because remember the way that she described her experience of going to Rome and Florence, she says in line 33, she had spent it in the protection of good hotels behind the glass windows of tour buses, and that's why she views it as not really having given her much experience. So really, we're just going to keep in mind these words safe and protected, and let's look at the answer choices. Choice A, they're uninterested in the thoughts and reactions of other people. So again, not that they're uninterested. Again, we're looking for something that means safe or protected. B, they're sheltered from exposure to new types of experience. So yeah, here you should be saying to yourself, oh, sheltered, that's kind of a synonym for safe and protected. So likely that's going to be the answer. Choice C, they feel overwhelmed by a cultural richness of their surroundings. So there's no indication that they feel overwhelmed by what they're seeing, or that's the reason they're not venturing out. Really, they're just talking about the fact that they're in sort of a very sheltered or safe or protected environment. So not overwhelmed and probably not by the cultural richness. Choice D, they're afraid of traveling to unfamiliar environments. One of the reasons might be that they're afraid of venturing out of their comfort zone, but there's really no evidence of that anywhere in the passage. We don't really know why they're protected. Is it their choice to stay in that environment? Is it because that was imposed on them? There's really nothing that's said about them being afraid. And likewise, from the sentence that we looked at, really the word that we were pointing at was safe. So that was the key idea. And so that means choice B is going to be the answer. Question 7, based on the passage, the wall, line 52, is best described as. So let's look at what she says about the wall. So start in line 51. She says, I wrote about the impenetrable wall of femaleness that formed my life. This apparently was what I knew. So what does she mean by that wall? Keep reading. It'll help if we go to the end of the paragraph. It says, I wrote about 3 different perfumes, Chanel No. 5, White Shoulders, and Joy, that could be smelled everywhere on campus, and about the 600 female voices rising up together at convocation to sing Gaudeamus. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's probably some Latin hymn or chant. So what is she saying about this wall? Obviously, she's connecting it to the fact that these 3 perfumes is what everyone uses and that they all get together to sing this song. So really, she's getting across this idea that everyone's kind of doing the same thing or following the same path. So let's see what the answers say about that. Choice A, a protective boundary that insulates the narrator from severe criticism. So protective boundary possibly, because we are talking about being sheltered in the passage, but insulating her from severe criticism, probably not. She's more saying that it protects her from actually getting real experience in the world. Choice B, a formidable barrier that must be overcome in order for one to succeed. So again, I think you could describe it as a formidable barrier, especially since she's using the image of a wall to describe, all the females around her or the sort of femaleness around her. But to say that it must be overcome in order for one to succeed, that also might be true, but that's really not what she's getting at in the description about, the perfumes and all of them singing together. So B, we'll keep it around, but not likely. C, an ominous presence that alerts writers to the consequences of failures. So ominous means something that is going to happen that's, dark or negative, but really we're not talking about the wall as alerting her to the consequences of failures. We're really talking about the wall that's kind of restricting her and that's causing people to actually be the same. Choice D, an inescapable constraint that encourages students' social conformity. So right here is exactly what she's talking about when she talks about all the females wearing the same 3 perfumes and all of them singing the same song. That's social conformity, everyone doing the same thing. So choice D is definitely going to be better than choice B. Question 8, which choice best provides evidence that the narrator idealizes Professor Castleman? So to idealize someone or something means you think of them in an ideal way. It could be very unrealistic. You're generally thinking of them in a way that's better than the reality. So let's go through each of these choices. Choice A, 64 to 65. It says, maybe that's what it was like to be a writer. Even with the eyes closed, you could see. So this could possibly work because what she's doing is she's imagining that Professor Castleman is a real writer, whereas she's kind of not because she's having all these difficulties. So A seems like it'll work. We'll keep it around. Choice B, 78 to 80. So start in 78, it says, from within the office, I could see Castleman at his desk. His jacket was off and he was in his shirt sleeves and tie. So this is kind of more of like a relaxed picture of him sort of relaxing in his office. Definitely not idealization. She's really just describing what he looks like. Choice C, line 87. So right over here, it says, he looked at it serenely. So this is him looking at her story. He probably has a piece of paper or printed out. So serenely means, he's looking at it in sort of a very calm manner. Again, this is not idealizing him or who he is. So choice C is not likely going to work. Choice D, 89 to 90. He says, I've read this twice, he said, and frankly, both times I found it to be wonderful. So again, this is very high regard for her story, but it's not her idealizing him or who he is as a professor or as a writer. So all that means is that choice A is going to be our best one, and we'll go with that. All right, so questions 9 and 10 should be done together. I always recommend read over the answers in the first one very briefly and see if you can eliminate any. So it says, based on the passage, the narrator feels indignant while waiting outside Professor Castleman's office, primarily because, so indignant, you have to keep in mind, it means angry about injustice. In other words, you're angry about a wrong that's been done, maybe to you, maybe to somebody else. So let's quickly go through the choices. Choice A, she believes Professor Castleman is deliberately ignoring her. I don't think so. There was really no indication of that. She was waiting outside, but it wasn't clear whether she had an appointment and he was delayed, or simply if he had to talk to other students first, or his office hours could be pretty much open door. So maybe she just had to wait until the other people were done. Choice B, she objects to Professor Castleman's slowness in grading her work. So if you remember in that passage, she was really mad because she thought that there was like a party going on inside. We'll look at that afterwards. But there was no indication that Professor Castleman was slow in grading her work. She really was just, eagerly anticipating to talk to him about it. So B, not likely going to work. Choice C, she resents the apparent frivolity of the meeting going on inside. So frivolous means not serious. And if you recall, as I just mentioned, she was imagining that there were drinks and a party going on. So C seems likely it's going to be the answer. Choice D, she disapproves of the topic of Abigail Brenner's story. So that was definitely true. Now, whether or not that's the reason she felt indignant waiting outside his office is, another question. Probably not. We can keep it around for now. Likely C is the strongest. We'll keep an eye on A and D. So moving on to question 10, which choice best provides the evidence? Let's look at it. So lines 66 to 68. So it says, during his office hours the following week, sitting at the bench in a hallway, I waited with nearly rabid anticipation. So this is choice A. There's no reason in here why she was waiting with a sense of indignation. Basically, all it's saying in these 2 lines or these 3 lines is that she was eagerly anticipating meeting with him. So choice A, going to be out. Choice B, 68 to 71. It says, someone was already in there. I could hear the dueling murmurs of a male voice and a female one, punctuated by an occasional shriek of female hilarity, all of which increased my annoyance. So yeah, this is possible that it's going to be an answer because here we're talking about her being annoyed. So we'll keep it around. And if this were true, that could possibly go along with choice C because she's hearing laughter inside. So that would back up the idea of a frivolous meeting. Choice C, 73 to 78. It says in line 73, finally, the door opened and Abigail Brenner, one of the other students from the class, emerged, holding her tedious story about her grandmother's recent death from double pneumonia, which she had been reworking on pointlessly since the first day of class. So this clearly backs up the idea that she didn't like her story because she's calling it tedious and that she had been reworking it pointlessly. So choice D, or choice C rather, does actually go along with choice D in question 9. B, we said, goes along with C. But the reason I wouldn't choose that pair, D and C, is because it's not actually answering the question. Clearly, the reason she feels indignant while waiting is because she's imagining that they're having all this fun inside. And it's not because of Abigail Brenner, the fact that she doesn't like her paper. She actually probably didn't even know that it was Abigail Brenner inside until she actually came out. So I'm going to reject choice C. Choice D, 81 to 82. Well, hello there, Miss Ames, he said, finally realizing that I was there. So again, this is just him saying hi to her. There's no indication that this in itself would make her indignant about anything, so D is going to be out. All that means is that choice B is the best answer, because in 68 to 71 it does talk about her being annoyed. I think honestly the real reason was like in lines 72, because it says, was there a party going on, were drinks being served, damp little sandwiches. So this is what's going on in her imagination. But out of all the choices, B for 10 is good, and that goes along with C in question 9.